I always thought my family was solid. Well, at least the family I had left. My dad had remarried when I was 14, and while I wasn't thrilled about it at first, I learned to accept my stepmom, Claire. She wasn't perfect, but she wasn't terrible either. At least, that's what I thought. When I was 24, my dad passed away unexpectedly. It was sudden, and the grief hit me harder than I expected. He wasn't just my father, he was my rock. He had always promised that he would take care of me, and I believed him. The will was simple, or so I thought. He'd left me everything: his house, his savings, his investments. Claire got a portion of the estate too, but that was nothing compared to what I was set to inherit. The first few days after the funeral were a blur, dealing with relatives, making arrangements, handling the emotional fallout. But then came the moment that would change everything. One afternoon, I went over to the house to start going through Dad's personal belongings. Claire was there, of course, but something felt off. She was acting strange, distracted, almost nervous. I chalked it up to her grieving process. It wasn't until I found the letter that things took a turn. I had been going through some papers in Dad's study when I stumbled upon a letter that was clearly addressed to Claire. It was sealed, and it wasn't like anything I'd seen before. I opened it, thinking it might be something personal, but the contents shook me to my core. In the letter, my dad had written that he had made some last-minute adjustments to the will, and in these adjustments, I was left with far less than I had originally thought. In fact, Claire was set to inherit a significant portion of what was supposed to be mine. The house, the savings, everything I thought was mine, was now being shared, or rather taken from me. The shock was like a punch in the stomach. I couldn't even breathe for a second. My father had always told me I was his priority. I had never imagined that he would leave me vulnerable to Claire, especially with her previous comments about how lucky I was to have the inheritance. But that's when the pieces started to fall into place. The truth hit me like a freight train. Claire had been planning this for months. She'd been buttering me up, pretending to be the loving stepmother, all the while plotting to take what was rightfully mine. I couldn't believe it. The one person I thought I could trust had betrayed me in the most heartless way possible. But I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. I wasn't just going to stand by and watch her take everything my father had promised me. I was going to fight for what was mine. I never had much. My mom passed away when I was young, and it was just me and my dad for most of my life. I learned early on that family was everything, even if it was just the two of us. My dad worked hard, sometimes taking on 2 jobs to make sure I never went without. We didn't live in a mansion or have lavish vacations, but we had love and we had each other. That was enough for me. When my dad remarried Claire, I was already in high school. I won't lie, I wasn't thrilled about the idea. I was protective of my dad, and the thought of someone else moving into our space was a little overwhelming. Claire, on the other hand, was warm and welcoming at first. She seemed to genuinely care for Dad, and for me, at least that's what I thought. She didn't try to replace my mom, but she did try hard to fit into the family dynamic, which I appreciated. Still, I never fully opened up to her. Something about her always felt off. She would say things like, "You're so lucky to have a dad like that. You don't know how rare it is." Or, "You should appreciate him more. Some people would kill to have a father like yours." These comments always made me feel uncomfortable, but I brushed them off as just her way of bonding. After all, what was I supposed to say? She wasn't a horrible person. She was just different. But I figured we were getting along well enough. Fast forward a few years. I'd finished college, landed a decent job, and was just starting to get a sense of stability in my life. Dad and Claire seemed to be doing well too, at least on the surface. The house was always immaculate, and Claire always seemed to be organizing some family event or dinner. It was like she was the perfect housewife, always the life of the party, always the one who made everything look effortless. And while I wasn't always close with her, I couldn't deny that she had my dad wrapped around her finger. Things started to shift, though, after my dad's health began to decline. He'd never been a very healthy man, but when he started having frequent doctor's visits and finally went in for a series of tests, I could tell something was wrong. My dad wasn't one to show weakness, but it was clear that he was struggling. Claire, on the other hand, seemed more concerned about securing her future than being genuinely supportive of him. At least, that's how it felt to me. When I'd visit them, I'd overhear snippets of conversations. Claire talking about setting things up for the future, about how she needed to make sure her and Dad's interests were protected. It was like she was preparing for something. But what? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I pushed those thoughts away. My dad was still there and I trusted him. I had to. It wasn't until a few months before my dad's death that I started to realize how serious things had become. Claire's behavior started to change. She was colder, more distant, especially when it came to anything involving money. Whenever I'd ask my dad about his will or his plans for the future, Claire would quickly interrupt, changing the subject or insisting that everything was already taken care of. She kept saying things like, "Don't worry about it. Your father and I have everything under control." It wasn't until after my dad passed away that I started to put the pieces together. Claire had been controlling everything. She had been the one talking to the lawyers, making decisions about Dad's estate, and even influencing the direction of his finances. I wasn't in the loop, and looking back, I realized how often I was excluded from conversations about the future of the family. It wasn't just that Claire had been planning for her own benefit. No, it was the fact that I had been sidelined. I was supposed to be my dad's heir, his only child. But in the end, Claire had wormed her way into everything, manipulating him into leaving her a bigger piece of the estate than I had ever expected. The day I found that letter, when I discovered that Claire was set to inherit part of my share of the estate, I felt betrayed. Betrayed by my dad for not seeing what Claire was doing, and betrayed by Claire for her calculated, cold-hearted manipulation. But the anger I felt wasn't just about the inheritance. It was the realization that Claire had taken advantage of my dad's trust and used his vulnerability for her own gain. I had trusted her. I had let her into my life, and now she was trying to take what was mine. I had always thought of her as part of the family, but she had only seen me as a means to an end. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't stand by and let her take what I had spent my whole life thinking was mine by right. No, this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about principle. It was about standing up for what was right, and I was ready to do whatever it took to make sure Claire didn't get away with it. The first thing I did after reading the letter was go straight to the lawyer who had helped my dad with his will. I had to know if this letter was legitimate. My heart was pounding as I sat in the lawyer's office, but he was calm, professional, and surprisingly accommodating. After all, my dad had been his client for years, and I trusted him. "Ms. Andrews, I understand your concern," the lawyer said as he adjusted his glasses. "However, I assure you that the will is entirely valid. Your father made a number of changes shortly before his passing. I've been instructed to keep the details confidential, but I can tell you that Claire is legally entitled to a portion of the estate." I sat there in stunned silence for a moment. It was worse than I thought. My dad had, in fact, changed his will, just as Claire had planned. She had made sure her future was secured, while I was left with a mere fraction of what I had expected. But why didn't he tell me? Why wasn't I involved in these decisions? I asked, feeling the anger bubbling inside me. The lawyer sighed. "Your father was in declining health. He was concerned about certain things, about how it might affect your relationship with Claire. He felt it was best to handle the changes privately." I wanted to scream, but I bit my tongue. I could feel my world starting to fall apart around me. Claire had not just manipulated my father, she had also taken away my place in the family legacy. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had spent years taking care of my father, running errands, helping out whenever he needed me. I'd always assumed that when the time came, I would be the one to take over his legacy, not Claire, not anyone else. And yet, here I was, left in the dark while she played her cards carefully, making sure everything went in her favor. The lawyer told me there was nothing he could do about the will, but he did offer a small piece of advice. If you feel the changes were made under duress, or if you think there's been undue influence, you can challenge the will in court, but that's a long and costly process. He didn't have to say it out loud, but I knew what he meant. I was up against a well-established, well-funded opponent. Claire had already been living in my father's house, managing the estate, and had the full backing of the will. If I wanted to get what was rightfully mine, I would need to fight her on her turf, and I had no intention of letting her win. I left the lawyer's office feeling a mix of determination and dread. I had to do something, but what? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just challenge the will in court. That would take too long, and by then, Claire would have already cemented her position. So I started gathering information. I dug into my dad's financial records, searching for any inconsistencies or signs of manipulation. Claire had been managing everything for years, but I knew she hadn't done it alone. She had connections, people who were more than willing to do whatever she needed. It wasn't just about the inheritance, it was about finding the truth. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself pulling late nights at the dining room table, sorting through spreadsheets, bank statements, and old emails. Claire had left behind a trail of clues, little things that didn't add up. There were certain payments to accounts I didn't recognize, and emails between Claire and her lawyer that mentioned things like finalizing adjustments and ensuring proper distribution. It was clear that Claire had orchestrated everything to her advantage, manipulating the situation at every turn. I also started asking around. I spoke to some of Dad's old colleagues, friends, anyone who might have insight into how Claire operated. The more I learned, the more I realized how calculated she was. She had been playing the long game, making sure she was in control every step of the way. No one else had noticed it, but I had, and that was what gave me the upper hand. One night, I received an email that changed everything. It was from an anonymous source, a whistleblower, someone who had been working with Claire for years and finally couldn't take it anymore. The email contained a copy of a secret financial agreement that Claire had arranged with my father, which guaranteed her a larger share of the estate in exchange for her loyalty. It was the smoking gun I needed. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I wasn't going to just sit back and let Claire get away with this. Now that I had the evidence, I knew I had to act quickly. I couldn't afford to give her more time to cover her tracks. I started reaching out to a few key people, a forensic accountant and a lawyer who specialized in inheritance disputes. They didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. The documents I had were enough to raise serious questions about the legitimacy of Claire's claim. The closer I got to my goal, the more I could feel Claire becoming paranoid. She was still confident, still playing the part of the loving wife, but I could tell she was starting to panic behind the scenes. Every time I saw her, she seemed a little more on edge, a little more defensive. It was like she could sense that her perfect plan was beginning to unravel. And that was when I knew. The time had come to make my move. I had all the pieces in place. The evidence I'd gathered, the financial records, the secret agreements, and the whistleblower's email was damning. Now, it was time to make my move. I knew Claire wouldn't see it coming. She had grown so confident in her position that she thought she was untouchable. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not anymore. The plan was simple: expose her manipulation in front of the people who could do something about it. The executor of the will, the lawyer, and the other family members who had been kept in the dark. Claire had been running the show for so long that she assumed her control over everything was absolute. But I knew better. I set up a meeting with the lawyer who had worked on my dad's estate, as well as a few key family members, some of whom had started to question Claire's involvement in everything. I wasn't going to take any chances, so I made sure that everything was in place, including a conference room, a projector, and enough documentation to make her squirm. When the day of the meeting arrived, I was calm on the outside, but inside, my heart was racing. Claire had no idea what was about to happen. She was already there, sitting confidently at the head of the table, flashing that polite fake smile that I had come to despise. The lawyer opened the meeting, and everything seemed normal at first. Claire was already talking about how the estate would be distributed, but I couldn't help but notice how smug she looked. It was like she was enjoying every minute of it, knowing that all of this was supposed to be hers. And then, just as she was about to make another statement about the inheritance, I stood up. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. I could feel Claire's gaze on me, but I wasn't intimidated. I had everything I needed, and I wasn't going to let her bully me anymore. Before we continue, I said, my voice steady, I think it's important that everyone here understands exactly what's been going on behind the scenes. I clicked a button on my laptop, and the projector screen flickered to life. The first slide showed a bank statement, one that Claire had tried to hide, a payment that was made from my dad's account to a third party. The next slide was a series of emails between Claire and her lawyer, discussing how they were going to finalize the will in her favor. The final slide showed the financial agreement that Claire had secretly made with my father, ensuring her a larger portion of the estate in exchange for her continued support. I could see the color drain from Claire's face as the documents flashed on the screen. She went pale, her smile vanishing, replaced by a look of panic. The lawyer who had worked on the estate looked confused at first and then angry. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he read through the documents I had presented. The family members who were there had no idea about Claire's involvement in these shady deals, and their shock was evident. I could almost hear Claire's heart racing as she stammered, trying to explain away the documents. This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice shaking. "These are just misunderstandings, mistakes." But I wasn't buying it. I had spent months digging into this, and now it was all coming to light. I wasn't going to let her lie her way out of this. "Don't try to deny it," I said, cutting her off. "You've been manipulating my father for years, getting him to change the will, making sure your share was as big as possible. You knew exactly what you were doing, and now it's time for everyone to see you for what you really are." Claire's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out, but instead, she just sat there, frozen, like she couldn't believe this was happening. The lawyer, who had been mostly silent up until that point, finally spoke up. "Ms. Andrews, I had no idea this was going on. I need to review these documents and report this to the authorities. This is serious." The room was silent as everyone processed the information. Claire tried to recover, but the damage was done. She knew she had lost control. The facade had shattered, and there was no way to cover up her lies anymore. I could see the panic in her eyes now. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. This was about her entire reputation, about losing everything she had worked so hard to manipulate into place. As the meeting ended, the lawyer promised to take immediate action. Claire was left speechless, unable to even defend herself. She had thought she was untouchable, but now everyone knew the truth. Her plan was exposed for what it was: a cold, calculated scheme to steal from me, to tear apart everything my father had left me. I could see the realization dawn on her. Her world was crumbling. She had tried to play the part of the grieving widow, the loving stepmother, but she had underestimated me, underestimated how far I would go to protect my family's legacy, and how much I was willing to fight for what was mine. As I walked out of the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. The weight that had been pressing down on me for months had finally lifted. I had taken control. Claire had no power left, and whatever was left of her carefully constructed life was slipping through her fingers. In the weeks that followed the meeting, things moved fast. The lawyer immediately began the process of investigating the documents I had provided, and Claire was forced to face the consequences of her actions. I'm sure she thought she could talk her way out of it, but there was no denying what had happened. The proof was there, and it was irrefutable. Claire tried to make a few desperate attempts to fix things. At first, she sent me emails, long, pleading messages about how she'd never intended for things to go this far, and how she was just trying to protect her future. She even promised to give me a larger share of the estate if I just dropped everything and forgave her. But I wasn't interested in her empty words anymore. Her next move was to go to my relatives. She tried to turn them against me, claiming that I was just being bitter and unreasonable, that I was destroying the family by challenging my father's will. But the truth had already been laid bare. No one was buying her lies anymore. In fact, many of them were disgusted by her manipulation and started distancing themselves from her. I was in control now. The investigation into the financial documents revealed even more shady dealings that Claire had tried to cover up. Payments to her personal accounts, adjustments made to the will without my knowledge, and emails where she directly manipulated my father's decisions. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Claire had taken advantage of my father's declining health, making sure she got everything she wanted while I was left in the dark. By the time the legal process finished, Claire's reputation was completely ruined. The lawyer had filed a formal complaint, and the case was brought before a judge. In the end, the will was challenged and overturned. The courts ruled that Claire's involvement in altering the will was fraudulent, and all of her claims to the estate were null and void. She was left with nothing. The media even got wind of the story. Articles were published about the stepmother who tried to manipulate her late husband's estate, and Claire became a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. She went from being the loving widow to a villain in the public eye. I remember reading one of the articles, my hands shaking as I read the words. It felt surreal, but in a strange way, it was also freeing. The woman who had tried to destroy me, who had tried to take everything I had been exposed. She was left with nothing but her own shame. As for me, I began to rebuild. It was never about the money, it was about the principle. I had fought for what was right, for the family legacy, for my father's memory. And, in the end, I got it back. My father's estate was divided properly, as he had originally intended, and I was given control of what should have been mine all along. But it wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about standing up for myself and showing that I wouldn't be a doormat anymore. Claire had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, I was the one who walked away with the power. A few months later, I received one last message from Claire. It was a simple, angry email, telling me how I had ruined her life and how I would never understand the sacrifices she made for Dad. I didn't even bother to respond. At that point, I didn't care anymore. Claire's life had fallen apart, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. Her schemes had backfired, and she had nobody left. I was finally free. Now, when I look back, I don't feel anger or regret. What I feel is pride. I fought for what was mine, and I won. Claire tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she had nothing left. I've moved on with my life, no longer haunted by the past or the fear of losing what was rightfully mine. I have my father's legacy intact, and more importantly, I have my integrity. It's a reminder to never let anyone take what's yours, no matter how much they try to manipulate or deceive you. Claire, on the other hand, she's still trying to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She's no longer the woman everyone thought she was, just a cautionary tale of greed, lies, and the consequences of betrayal. As for me, I'm standing tall, knowing that when it mattered most, I didn't back down. The past is behind me now, but it's shaped who I am today. Someone who's learned that when you fight for what's right, you don't just win, you take control of your own future.